In the fall of 2001, on a 2-lane county road outside of Haskell in east central Oklahoma, a 41-year-old woman named Edna Bryce spent $847 at a farm supply store in Muskogee on 14 bags of dried molasses, 2 pallets of inoculant powder, and a used broadcast spreader with a cracked wheel guard that the store manager apologized for and discounted by $20. She loaded it herself into the back of her late husband's '96 Chevy Silverado. She didn't ask for help. She drove the 38 miles back to Sequoyah County with the windows down and the radio off, and when she turned off the state road onto her gravel drive, the sun was already low and the pecan trees along the creek were starting to go yellow at the edges. Her neighbor, Floyd Tamblin, was moving irrigation pipe in his field along the property line, and he watched her drive past. He could see the bags stacked in the truck bed, dark as mulch, labeled in green and white. He couldn't read the labels from where he stood. He watched until she turned up toward the barn. He didn't wave because Edna Bryce was not a woman who expected a wave when she was working. That was October of 2001. Over the next 5 years, Mays County and the surrounding townships would have a story to tell about Edna Bryce and what she was doing to her soil. Like all stories in small agricultural communities, it traveled by way of the feed store and the grain elevator and the extension office, waiting room, and the parking lot of the First Baptist Church on Sundays after service. And at every stop, it got a little simpler and a little more dismissive, because what Edna was doing to her 880 acres didn't look like farming to anyone who drove past on County Road 7. What it looked like, to those who knew anything about row crop land in eastern Oklahoma, was neglect. Let me tell you about Edna Bryce. Because what she did with that land over the next 5 years only makes sense if you understand where she started and what she was carrying when she started it. Edna was born in 1960 in a farmhouse outside of Wagoner, the oldest of 3 children. Her father, Clyde Oswalt, ran a soybean and grain sorghum operation on about 600 acres of bottomland and upland mixed, the kind of farm that worked well in wet years and struggled badly in dry ones. Clyde was not a sentimental man about land. He was a practical man in the way that generation of farmers was practical, which meant he believed in inputs: fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, and tillage. If a field was underperforming, you worked it harder. You added more nitrogen. You tilled deeper. You bought a newer sprayer. The soil was a medium, not a partner. It held seeds and received water. That was its job. Edna had grown up helping with planting and harvest and understood the logic of it. She had also grown up watching her father's yield maps flatten. The same fields, the same inputs, the same weather, but the numbers edging downward year after year through the 90s in a way that no one in the county talked about directly, because talking about it directly meant admitting something that had no easy fix. She married Paul Bryce in 1984. Paul was a cattle and hay operation out of Sequoyah County, a rangy, deliberate man who had inherited 880 acres from his family and added 60 more through a lease arrangement on the south end. Paul was not like her father. Paul watched his soil. He would pick up a handful and rub it between his palms and tell you things about it that he couldn't always put into words, just a sense he had from years of handling it, that it was tired or working or too wet or missing something. He kept records, not detailed records, not the kind that would impress an agronomist, but a calendar on the equipment shed wall where he noted planting dates and rainfall, and what the field looked like going in and coming out of each season. Paul died in March of 1999. Pancreatic cancer. He was 52 years old. He was diagnosed in January. and gone by the end of March, and the ground was still frozen when they buried him. After the funeral, Paul's older brother drove down from Tulsa and sat at Edna's kitchen table and suggested she sell the hay fields, lease out the cropland, and move somewhere smaller. "Take the time," he said. "You don't have to carry all this alone." Edna thanked him for the coffee and told him she had a delivery to coordinate. He drove back to Tulsa that afternoon. She went out to check the fence line along the south lease. She managed the operation by herself for 2.5 years before the soil reports stopped making sense. What Edna Bryce saw in those years after Paul died was something she didn't have language for immediately, but recognized from memory. She recognized it the way you recognize a slow leak. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to on a single day and say, "There, that is the problem." But the hay yields on her upland fields were soft, not collapsed, just soft. The crimson clover she overseeded every fall was germinating thin in the middle of the fields, dense at the edges, which meant something was wrong in the middle, in the soil itself, below the surface where you couldn't see it. The organic matter readings on her annual tests had dropped 0.2% over 3 years, which didn't sound like much until she thought about how long it took to build 0.2% of organic matter in a clay loam soil, and what it meant that it was going the other direction. She had been reading. Not the commodity farm magazines that came to the house, though she read those too. She had ordered a book out of a catalog from a soil scientist named Elaine Ingham, who worked out of Oregon and had spent 20 years studying the biology of agricultural soil, the fungi and bacteria and protozoa and nematodes that lived in healthy ground and were largely absent from ground that had been tilled and chemically treated for decades. The idea was not complicated once you understood it, but it was completely at odds with everything Clyde Oswald had taught her about what soil was for. Soil was not just a medium, it was a system. A living system with its own food web and its own logic, and that system could either work with a crop or work against it, depending on whether you were feeding it or killing it. Synthetic nitrogen fed the plant but bypassed the biology. Tillage disrupted the fungal networks that moved nutrients and water to root zones in ways that no amount of added fertilizer could replicate. The compaction her upland fields were showing wasn't just a mechanical problem from heavy equipment. It was a biological collapse. The soil structure that living organisms built and maintained over decades had been slowly undone, and without it, rain ran off instead of soaking in, roots couldn't penetrate, and yields softened and kept softening no matter what you sprayed on them. The solution, or the beginning of a solution, was to put life back into the ground, cover crops. Not the simple winter rye that some farmers overseeded for erosion control, but complex mixes, 5 or 6 species sown together, legumes and brassicas and grasses and deep-rooted forbs, each one doing something different in the soil profile, feeding different organisms, breaking up different layers, fixing nitrogen in different forms, and then not tilling them in, letting them winter kill or crimp them down and plant directly through the residue, leaving the fungal networks intact, building organic matter one season at a time. This was what the dried molasses was for. Molasses fed soil bacteria in the early establishment phase, when you were asking biology to colonize ground that had almost none. The inoculant powder carried mycorrhizal fungi. You mixed it with the seed before planting. It cost more per acre than anything Clyde Oswald had ever spent on a biological amendment, and it was invisible. You put it in the ground, and you waited. Floyd Tamblyn noticed the change in October of 2001. because the field Edna seeded first was the one along their shared property line, and the mix she sowed was tall enough by November to see clearly from his tractor. He mentioned it at the grain elevator in Haskell the following week. He said he wasn't sure what Edna Bryce was doing over there, but it looked like she'd planted about 20 different things in the same field, and none of them were anything he recognized from a cash crop. The elevator manager, a man named Curtis Walling, who had worked there for 19 years, said that was interesting. And what did it look like? Floyd said it looked like a mess, like someone had emptied a seed catalog into a spreader and driven back and forth until the bag was empty. Curtis laughed. The two men in line behind him laughed. That was the beginning of the story. The story went like this. Edna Bryce had been through a hard few years since Paul passed, and she'd gotten hold of some ideas from out west, Oregon or somewhere, about soil biology. And she was out there on her upland fields planting things nobody in Sequoyah County had ever planted for anything other than animal feed. And she wasn't tilling, which in itself was enough to make a person wonder. You couldn't farm clay loam ground in eastern Oklahoma without tillage. Everybody knew that. The ground got too compacted, too weedy, too hard to work. The old teamers had tilled. Her own father tilled. Paul Bryce had tilled. The county extension office recommended tillage. You didn't just stop tilling because a book from Oregon told you to. The story was told with more confusion than cruelty. People in Mays County and Sequoyah County didn't dislike Edna Bryce. She was a capable woman who had kept an 880-acre operation running alone for 2 years, which was not a small thing. But she was doing something that looked wrong, and when something looks wrong from the road in a farming community, the community notices and talks about it. And the talking has a way of becoming the explanation before anyone has checked whether the looking was accurate. Floyd Tamblin's wife mentioned it to her sister in November. The sister taught school in Haskell and mentioned it to another teacher whose husband farmed corn ground south of town. By January, if you said Edna Bryce's name at the elevator, Curtis Walling would smile and say, "Yeah, the soil lady," and leave it at that. In the second year, Edna expanded. She converted 2 more fields on the upland portion of her property, about 340 acres total now, under what she was privately calling her transition plan, a term she used in her notebook but never out loud because it sounded like something that needed defending, and she had no interest in defending it to anyone who hadn't asked a serious question. She built a soil monitoring protocol from a method she had adapted from Ingham's work and a USDA publication on biological indicators. Every spring, she took 12 soil samples from each field, measured infiltration rates with a coffee can and a stopwatch, and sent the samples to a lab in Stillwater for full biological assay. She taped the results inside the back cover of a 3-ring binder she kept on the shelf above the desk in the equipment shed, next to Paul's calendar from 1998, which she had never taken down. She was also talking by telephone in the evenings after the work was done to 2 other women who were doing similar things. One ran a grain farm in Kansas, the other a vegetable operation in Missouri. They had found each other through an online forum that Edna had discovered on the Farm Bureau's website, a message board for what was being called at the time regenerative agriculture, a phrase that had not yet made it to the vocabulary of anyone at the Haskell grain elevator. These conversations were long and technical, and sometimes ran past 10 at night, and they covered topics like fungal to bacterial ratios and carbon to nitrogen balances in cover crop mixes and the correct timing for rolling a cereal rye crop before it went to seed. Edna's telephone bill was higher than it had ever been. her neighbor on the east side. Phyllis, a woman named Phyllis who worked part-time at the county assessor's office and had an interest in other people's business that she would have called community spirit, noticed the change in the monthly average when she happened to mention phone bills in conversation, and Edna gave a number that was $30 higher than it had been 2 years ago. Phyllis told her husband. Her husband mentioned it to Curtis Walling at the elevator. The phone calls and the strange field mix merged into a single story about a woman who had gone looking for answers in the wrong direction after a loss and hadn't found her way back yet. By the end of 2003, if you mentioned Edna Bryce's fields to the right people at the elevator, you got a shake of the head and a short version of the story that took about 45 seconds and ended the same way every time. She's not tilling, and she's planting weeds on purpose. Nobody knew what to make of it. 2 things were happening on Edna's property in 2003 that were invisible from County Road 7. The first was the soil. In the fields that had now completed 2 full cover crop cycles, something was changing that she could measure but not entirely explain. The infiltration rate in the upland fields, the rate at which an inch of water disappeared into the soil, had increased from 0.4 inches per hour to 1.1 inches per hour. That didn't sound dramatic, but it meant the difference between runoff and absorption in a heavy rain event, and it meant the difference between a field that held moisture through a dry August and one that didn't. The organic matter had ticked up from 2.1% to 2.4%. The biology assay from Stillwater showed active fungal biomass in the transition fields that had been essentially undetectable 2 years earlier. She had earthworms, not many, but some, in ground that had had none that she could find when she started. The second thing was her hay. Her hay yields on the transitioned fields were not higher yet. She was clear-eyed about this and wrote it in her notebook without flinching. The yields were flat or slightly down, which was normal in a transition period, she said, when you were asking a soil system to rebuild itself, and the crop hadn't yet learned to use what the soil was beginning to offer. But the quality was different. Her hay was testing higher in protein and mineral density than it had in 5 years. She had a buyer. She had a buyer in Tahlequah, and who had started calling her before a cutting was done to ask if she had hay available. He told her once that his cows milked better on her hay than on anything else he bought in the county. She thanked him and wrote the date in her notebook. She didn't mention this at the elevator. She didn't say anything at the county extension meeting in February of 2004 when the cover crop discussion came up briefly and got moved past quickly in favor of the herbicide resistance update, which was the item everyone had come for. Edna sat in the 3rd row and did not raise her hand. This was not unusual. She was a listener in meetings, the way Paul had been, storing things up. In the spring of 2004, a woman named Dr. Reeves from the agronomy department at Oklahoma State called Edna's number. She had been given the name by a contact in the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service who had seen Edna's soil assay results forwarded by the Stillwater lab and had flagged them as unusual for Sequoyah County. Dr. Reeves was studying biological transition in conventionally farmed soils in the southern plains, and she had been looking for a site in eastern Oklahoma for 2 years. Edna said she was welcome to come out. Dr. Reeves drove down on a Wednesday in May with a graduate student and a set of sample bags and spent 4 hours walking Edna's fields. She was a dry July. She was methodical and not easily impressed, and she got down on her knees in the cover crop residue and looked at what was under it with a hand lens. She looked at the binder on the equipment shed shelf, she looked at the infiltration records and asked Edna to walk her through the methodology. When she left, she asked if she could come back in the fall to do a formal comparison with conventionally managed fields of similar soil type in the county. Edna said yes without hesitating. Dr. Reeves came back in September with 2 graduate students and a funded research plan. She spent a week on Edna's property and 3 days on 2 neighboring farms, with the neighbors' permission, which she obtained herself. She did not tell either neighboring farmer what she expected to find. She was careful in the way researchers are careful when they have a hypothesis they don't want to contaminate with enthusiasm. She called Edna in November. Her voice on the phone was measured. She said that the infiltration rate in Edna's transitioned fields was 2.8 times higher than in the comparable conventional fields in the comparison group. Soil organic matter in the transition fields was statistically significantly higher across all 12 sampling sites. Fungal biomass was present at levels consistent with native grassland soils rather than agricultural soils, which was, she said, not something she had expected to see in a 5-year transition. Earthworm counts in the transitioned fields were 11 per square foot on average. In the comparison fields, the average was less than 1. There was a pause. Edna said, "What does that mean for yield projections going forward?" Dr. Reeves said she would rather wait for 1 more season of data before making yield projections. But she said the trajectory was clear, and the trajectory was positive, and that what Edna had done in 5 years was something that most agronomists would have said required 15. Edna thanked her, wrote the numbers down in the binder, and went out to walk the south field before dark. She stood at the edge of the cover crop for a while. The mix she'd seeded in September still low to the ground, green and dense and smelling of turned earth and something else. Something that wasn't quite identifiable, but that she associated in her mind with the word alive, in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't walked soil for most of their adult life. She didn't call anyone. The winter of 2005 was dry in eastern Oklahoma. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of dry that makes the news, but the kind that arrives quietly in November and stays, that turns the creek beds to sand by January and makes the pastures crackle underfoot in February. By the time March came, the county extension office had issued an advisory about soil moisture deficits going into planting season. Floyd Tamblin was having trouble in his corn ground. His germination rates were down, and he had standing water in some low spots and bone-dry crust in others, which was the particular misery of compacted soil in a dry spring. Too hard where it should be soft and nowhere for what little moisture there was to go. He drove past Edna's property on a Tuesday morning in late March and slowed down at the fence line. Her cover crop residue was still lying flat on the ground, brown and matted, the way it was supposed to look, holding the soil underneath it against the wind and whatever rain came. He could see the dark color of the soil at the edges of the mat where it was disturbed by the deer that came through at night. Dark meant moisture. Dark meant organic matter holding water that the surrounding fields were losing. He sat there in his truck for 3 minutes, with the engine running, and then drove on. He didn't mention it to anyone immediately. Floyd Tamblin was not a man who changed his mind loudly. The dry spring became a dry summer. Not 1988 dry, not catastrophe, but the kind of summer that separated the fields that could hold water from the fields that couldn't. By June, the yield projections across the county were being revised downward. The corn ground south of Haskell was stressed. The soybean fields along the creek bottoms were holding better because bottomland soil has a different constitution. But the upland ground, the ground that looked like Edna's ground, was struggling. Edna's upland fields were not struggling. Her first cutting came in at the highest tonnage she had recorded in 7 years on those acres. The protein content was 18.4%, which was high enough that the dairy buyer in Tahlequah called her the same week the test results came back and asked if she had ever considered a long-term supply agreement. Her soil moisture readings in late June were measurably higher than the county average. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but consistently and measurably, the way something real is different, rather than the way something lucky is different. Curtis Walling heard about it in July from the dairy buyer, who mentioned it to a hay broker who came through the elevator, who mentioned it to Curtis as a point of interest. Curtis had been telling the story about the soil lady and her weed fields for 4 years. By then, he stood at the elevator counter for a moment, after the hay broker left, and thought about it, and then got back to the paperwork on his desk. He didn't tell anyone what he'd heard. Not immediately. Floyd Tamblyn came by Edna's property in early August without calling ahead. He found her pulling soil samples from the south field, working with a probe she'd made from a length of half-inch conduit with a calibrated tape measure threaded through it. He watched her for a moment from the fence line and then walked over. They stood there in the field together without speaking immediately, which was fine because Floyd Tamblyn and Edna Bryce had been neighbors for 15 years, and they were comfortable with quiet. He said, "Your south field looks different than mine." She said, "What does yours look like?" He said it looked like the road in places. She pulled another core and held it up. The soil was dark at the top and stayed dark 4 inches down before lightening into the clay subsoil. His would have gone pale in an inch. She said, "Come to the shed. I'll show you what I've been measuring." What happened over the following 6 months was not a single moment. There was no community gathering, no dramatic reversal. No day when Floyd Tamblyn stood up at the elevator and announced he had been wrong. What happened was quieter than that, and it was the quietness that made it real. Floyd started asking questions. Careful questions, the way a man asks who doesn't want to admit he's been watching something he doesn't understand. He asked about the cover crop seed mix and where she bought it. He asked about the inoculant and whether it actually worked or whether that was more of a theory. He asked about the tilling or the not tilling and how she managed weeds without it. Edna answered everything directly, the way her mother had answered questions, which was without preamble and without condescension. Curtis Walling ordered a pallet of cover crop seed mix in September. He'd never stocked cover crop mixes for biological purposes before, only for erosion control. He put it near the front of the store. He didn't put up a sign. 3 farmers asked about it within 2 weeks of it going on the floor. Dr. Reeves presented her findings at a regional soil health conference in Tulsa in October of 2005. One slide showed the comparative soil cores from Sequoyah County. The transitioned cores were photographed next to the conventional cores, and the difference in color and texture was visible to anyone in the auditorium who had ever held soil in their hands. The presentation referenced the Bryce operation by county and soil type. Edna had approved this after thinking it over for a week. In February of 2006, the Sequoyah County Soil and Water Conservation District held a field day at Edna's property. It was not a large event. 31 farmers attended, which was more than they had expected. They arrived in pickups and SUVs and parked along County Road 7 and walked in through the gate, and Edna met them at the gate and took them to the upland fields first. She was not a natural public speaker. She had never addressed a group in her life. But the binder was not a speech. It was a record, and she explained it the way Paul had explained a fence repair, which was, from the beginning, with the tools laid out in order, the problem stated plainly, the solution described without fanfare. She showed them the infiltration data, year by year. She showed them the biology assays and explained what the numbers meant in terms that did not require a degree to follow. She showed them the hay-quality data and the yield trajectory. She let them pull soil cores side by side from the transitioned and untransitioned portions of the same field, because she still had one field she hadn't converted, kept deliberately for comparison purposes, the way you keep a control. An older farmer from the east side of the county, a man in his late 60s named Walter, pulled a core from the transitioned field and then walked to the fence line and pulled one from the untransitioned side. He held them up next to each other for a while without saying anything. He said, "My father ran this same type of ground for 30 years, and he never saw a color difference like this from one side of a fence to the other," Edna said. "Neither did I when I started," he said. "How long did it take," she said, "to see the first change?" "About 2 seasons. To see something you could measure reliably, about 4. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the cores over in his hands. He said, "I've got 200 acres on the east side that won't hold rain for a week after a thunderstorm. I've been putting nitrogen on that ground for 20 years and I keep putting more, and the numbers don't move." He looked at the core from the transitioned field. Then he looked at Edna. He said, "I'm 67 years old. If I start this spring, will I see enough to know if it's working?" Edna looked at him. She did not answer immediately because the question deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. She said, "The first 2 years, you'll think it isn't working. That's when most people stop. If you get past 2 years and you're still measuring, you'll see something in year 3 that will tell you to keep going." He nodded. He put the cores down on the fence post side by side and looked at them one more time. He said, "Paul Bryce was a good farmer." She said yes. He said, "I think he'd have figured this out on his own eventually." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I think he'd have gotten there before me." He was a better observer. The man picked up his hat off the fence post and put it back on. He said, "I'll call the lab in Stillwater and get on their sampling schedule for spring." Edna said she'd send him the binder contact list, the names of the people she'd been talking to in Kansas and Missouri, the forum addresses, the book titles. He thanked her and walked back to the group. The 31 farmers stood in Edna's upland field for a while longer, looking at the ground that 5 years ago had been going pale and thin and losing its ability to hold what fell on it. Floyd Tamblyn was there, standing a little apart from the group the way a man stands when he knows he has some thinking to do. Curtis Walling had come, which surprised some people because Curtis was an elevator man and not a farmer, but he had brought his own notebook and was writing in it. There was a moment near the end of the field walk when Edna stopped the group at the edge of the first field she had converted, the one along Floyd's property line, the one he had watched her plant from his tractor in October of 2001 and described at the elevator as a mess. The cover crop residue from the fall planting was lying flat on the surface. Underneath it, she knew. The biology was running. The fun threading through the spaces between particles, the bacteria cycling nitrogen in forms the roots could use, the earthworms pulling residue down and leaving channels that would carry the spring rain deep, instead of letting it sheet off the surface and take the topsoil with it. She didn't. She didn't say any of that. It would have taken too long, and some of it she could still not say, precisely, because it was not precise. It was alive and living things resist the exact language you want to put on them. She said, "The first day I seeded this field, Floyd Tamblyn was moving pipe in his field over there, and he watched me. He couldn't tell from that distance what I was putting down or why." She paused. She said, "I couldn't have explained it to him that day either. I understood the theory. I didn't understand yet what I was looking at in my own soil, because I hadn't been looking at it long enough." Floyd, from the edge of the group, didn't say anything. He looked at his boots. She said, "My father taught me that farming is a transaction. You put something in, you take something out. That's not wrong, but it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is that the soil is doing something with what you put in, and if the soil is not healthy enough to do that work, no amount of what you put in will make up for it." My husband understood this. He didn't have the language for it, but he understood it, and he watched his soil the way you watch something you want to understand, which is different from watching something you think you already know. She let that land. She said, "I started this because the ground was going in the wrong direction, and I could measure it going wrong, and I couldn't find an answer in what I had been taught. I kept going because the numbers said keep going, even when the yield said I might be wrong. That's the chart. That's all the chart is. It's permission to keep going when you can't see the end of it yet." The questions went on for another hour. She answered all of them. She said, "I don't know 3 times, each time, about something specific, and each time wrote down the name of someone who might know so she could pass the contact on later." Near the end, Curtis Walling raised his hand. He was a little sheepish about it. He said, "Edna, I have to ask you something. When you started in 2001, and people around here were saying you'd planted a field full of weeds, and you drove past the elevator, and you knew what we were saying, did you ever think about just stopping and going back to how it was done?" The group was quiet. Edna looked at Curtis for a moment. She said, "Every spring, until the numbers gave me a reason not to." The quiet that came after that was the kind of quiet a room falls into when something true has been said in plain language. There is nothing to add to it, and everyone in the room knows it at the same time. By 2008, 9 farms in Sequoyah County were in some stage of biological transition. Not all of them were doing it the way Edna had done it, and not all of them were getting the same results. Because the results depend on patience and consistency, and a willingness to keep measuring even when what you're measuring doesn't seem to be moving. But 9 farms were trying. Floyd Tamblyn converted his corn ground in the spring of 2007. It took him 3 seasons. It took him 3 seasons to see the infiltration improvement he was looking for. And he called Edna the evening he pulled the cores that finally showed what he'd been waiting for. And she listened to him describe the soil color and the depth of the dark layer and the way the probe had gone in without the resistance he was used to. And she said that sounds about right, and asked him what his earthworm count was. He said he hadn't counted yet. She said to go count. He laughed for the first time in their conversation and went back out to the field with a flashlight. Walter, the man from the field day, who had asked if he was too old to start, began his first transition season in April of 2006 and called Edna at the end of year 2 to tell her she had been right about the first 2 years. He said he had almost stopped twice. He said he wanted her to know he hadn't. She said she was glad to hear it and asked about his hay protein numbers. They talked about soil for 40 minutes. He was 69 years old by then, and he told Edna before he hung up that this was the most interested he had been in farming since the early years, when he had still believed there were things left to learn about the ground. Edna said there were always things left to learn about the ground. The ground had the patience for it, even when the people didn't. Dr. Reeves published a full paper in 2007 in a peer-reviewed journal on soil biology. One section was about the Bryce farm in Sequoia County. It used words like statistically significant and biologically unprecedented for conventionally farmed transition timelines. Edna read it twice, and she thought the academic language was too coarse for what it was trying to say. But she understood that careful language was what gave the findings weight in the rooms, where decisions about farming policy got made, and she appreciated that the findings were getting into those rooms. In April of 2008, the NRCS office in Tahlequah, the same office that had had no farmers in the county to refer Dr. Reeves to when she first started looking in 2004, listed the Bryce farm as a demonstration site for soil health practices under a new federal initiative. They put her name on a printed brochure. Edna read the brochure in the parking lot and corrected one sentence where the timeline was slightly wrong and mailed it back with a note. That spring, the cover crop along County Road 7 was the same as it had been every spring since 2002. Dense and varied and low to the ground in April and impossible to identify from a moving vehicle unless you knew what you were looking for. Floyd Tamblin drove past it every morning on his way to check his own fields, and he had stopped finding it unusual, which was a thing that happened when a thing worked long enough that it became part of the landscape. He pulled over one morning in May and got out and walked to Edna's fence line and stood there looking at the field. There was a light wind off the hills to the east, and the cover was moving in it, the various stems and heads at slightly different heights catching the movement in different ways, and underneath it the soil was doing what it had been slowly taught to do over 7 years, which was hold what it had and use it and offer it back in forms that the next crop could find. Floyd stood there for a while, not oyed. He had his hands on the top wire, and he was looking at the ground the way you look at something you misjudged for a long time and are not quite finished reckoning with. He did not feel bad about the reckoning. He felt, mostly, that it was overdue. He got back in his truck and drove on. That is the thing about the ground. It does not require you to understand it before it begins to recover. It only requires that you stop working against it and give it enough of what it needs and enough time to use what you've given it. The timeline is the ground's timeline, not yours. Your job is to keep the chart and come back and measure and not mistake patience for failure. Edna Bryce figured that out with $847 and a used spreader and a book from Oregon that she found in a farm supply catalog in 1999, 2 months after she buried her husband in frozen ground in March. She kept the chart. The ground did the rest.